The image is seared into the soul of a nation. 6 men, straining against a heavy steel pipe, planting the stars and stripes on the bloody summit of Mount Suribachi. It was the picture that won a Pulitzer Prize, a bronze monument in Washington, D.C., the very definition of American valor and victory in the Pacific. But what if everything you know about that moment is wrong? What if that iconic flag, captured for all time by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, was not the first? This is the story that was almost lost to the sulphurous winds of Iwo Jima, a story of a different flag, raised by different men, a fleeting moment of triumph that vanished into the fog of war. The famous photo was the second flag. The first flag, raised by 6 Marines just hours earlier, disappeared that night, and with it the true story of the men who dared to hope on that hellish island. For 79 years the mystery festered. Who raised that first flag? And more chillingly, who took it? The answers would unravel a secret buried under decades of glory, jealousy, and the simple, desperate need of one man to possess a piece of hope. This is the story of the forgotten first flag of Iwo Jima. The dawn of February 23, 1945, broke not with light, but with a slow, grim revelation. The island of Iwo Jima was a monstrous alien landscape, 8 square miles of volcanic ash and rock that refused to hold a footprint. The air was thick with the stench of rotten eggs from the sulfur vents, a pervasive poison that mixed with the coppery tang of blood and the acrid smoke of cordite. From the dominant height of Mount Suribachi, a dormant volcano at the southern tip, the Japanese watched every move. Their fortress was not built on the island, but inside it, a labyrinth of tunnels, caves, and reinforced concrete pillows that had turned the American naval bombardment into a futile, thunderous prelude. For the Marines of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Divisions, who had stormed the black sand beaches 2 days prior, this was not a battle for territory, but for survival. Every inch of ground was contested from an invisible enemy. They fought in a horrifying 3-dimensional battlefield, where death could come from a machine gun nest ahead, a sniper in a palm tree ahead, or a grenade tossed from a hidden spider hole at their feet. The casualty counts were already staggering, a bloody arithmetic that threatened to overwhelm the entire operation. The strategic imperative was clear, a simple order that meant certain death for the men tasked to carry it out. Take Mount Suribachi. From its summit, the Japanese controlled every landing beach, every supply dump, every inch of the island. As long as Suribachi stood, the Americans were pinned, exposed, and dying. The order filtered down to the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines. A 40-man patrol from Easy Company was to fight their way up the treacherous 550-foot slope. Their mission was not to raise a flag, but to reconnoiter, to probe the defenses, and, if possible, to seize the summit. Among them were 6 men who would become central to a mystery. First Lieutenant Harold Schreer, a quiet, competent officer handed a folded American flag by Battalion Colonel Chandler Johnson with the offhand order, "If you get to the top, put it up." Sergeant Ernest Boots Thomas, a squad leader from Florida with a cool head under fire. Corporal Charles Lindbergh, a tough-as-nails fighter from Minnesota. Private First Class James Michaels, a young Marine from Chicago who had just celebrated his 19th birthday in the bowels of a troopship. And 2 men whose names would become momentarily famous before being eclipsed by the second raising, Private Phil Ward and Hospital Corpsman John Bradley. They began the climb, a slow, agonizing ascent through loose ash that slid away with every step. Their world narrowed to the sound of their own labored breathing, the crunch of their boots, and the ever-present expectation of a bullet. They moved in a low crouch, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning the black rock for any sign of movement. The silence was more terrifying than the noise of battle. It was a predator's silence. They passed the blasted entrances of caves, dark mouths that seemed to breathe out the cold air of the underground fortress. They expected at any moment to be met by a hail of gunfire, a banzai charge, or the shattering explosion of a mortar shell. But it never came. The Japanese, for reasons only known to their commander, had withdrawn deeper into the mountain. The Marines reached the summit crater, a scarred and pockmarked bowl, expecting a fight to the death. They fanned out, securing a small perimeter, their nerves stretched to the breaking point by the eerie quiet. Then they spotted it. A long, heavy piece of Japanese water pipe lying discarded amidst the rubble. This was it. This was the moment. Lieutenant Schreier unfurled the flag, a small 54 by 28-inch banner he had stuffed inside his jacket. The men gathered around, lashing the flag to the pipe with a length of rope. The world held its breath. Down below, on the beaches and on the ships dotting the gray ocean, thousands of American eyes were turned towards the mountain. The fight for Suribachi had been witnessed by the entire invasion force. And then they saw it. A small spot of color against the bleak, gray-brown summit. A flicker of red, white, and blue. As the 6 Marines, Schreier, Thomas, Lindbergh, Michaels, Ward, and Bradley heaved the heavy pipe upright and planted it into the volcanic rock, a sound began to swell from the island below. It started as a few scattered cheers, then grew into a roar that rolled across the beaches and out to the fleet. Men wept, shouted, hugged each other. Ships' whistles and horns blared, a deafening symphony of relief and pride. For a few precious minutes, the hell of Iwo Jima was forgotten. On the summit, the small patrol felt a surge of emotion so powerful it was dizzying. They had done it! They had scaled the mountain and planted the flag. They posed for pictures, a Navy photographer from a landing craft capturing their grins, their hands on their helmets, the flag snapping proudly in the wind behind them. It was a perfect moment of triumph. But perfection, in war, is fragile. And down below, watching through binoculars, a powerful man saw the small flag and made a decision that would change history and set in motion a chain of events that would see this symbol of hope vanish from the face of the earth, igniting a mystery that would last for nearly 80 years. The man watching from below was Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who had just come ashore to witness the battle firsthand. As his landing craft crunched onto the black sand, his eyes were locked on the small flag fluttering atop Suribachi. He turned to the commander of the expeditionary troops, General Holland Howling Mad Smith, his voice filled with a kind of reverent awe. "Holland," he said, "the raising of that flag on Suribachi means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years." It was a grand, historic sentiment. But for the pragmatic, battle-hardened Marine commanders on the ground, it was also a potential disaster. That small flag, a battalion marker procured from a landing ship, was now a priceless national relic. And Colonel Chandler Johnson, the gruff battalion commander who had given Schreier the flag, saw its vulnerability immediately. "Some son of a bitch is going to want that flag," he barked to his staff, "but he's not going to get it. That's our flag." The flag on the mountain was a beacon, but also a target. It was too small, he argued. Many of the men fighting and dying below couldn't even see it. And, most importantly, it was a piece of Marine Corps history that he was determined to preserve for his battalion. He wanted it replaced, and he wanted the original saved. His order was swift and decisive. "Get another flag," he told his adjutant, "and get it up there." The new flag was larger, a 96 by 56-inch banner procured from a tank landing ship, the LST-779. The mission to replace the flag was given to a runner, a former cowboy from Arizona named Private Rene Gagnon, who was handed the folded flag and told to take it to the summit. Unbeknownst to Gagnon, another man was also heading up the mountain, a man whose name would become synonymous with the moment, Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal. He had missed the first raising, and upon hearing a second, larger flag was going up, he decided to make the climb, hoping for a better picture. The scene on the summit was one of controlled chaos. The 40-man patrol was still securing the area, probing cave entrances and watching for enemy movement. The first flag, the one raised by Schreier's men, still flew from its water pipe. A second, longer Japanese pipe had been found. As Rosenthal arrived, puffing and sweating, he saw a group of 6 Marines, some from the original patrol, some who had just arrived as reinforcements, preparing to raise the new, larger flag. They were Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona, Franklin Sousley, a farm boy from Kentucky, Harlan Block, a football star from Texas, Michael Strank, a charismatic sergeant from Pennsylvania, and 2 men who had been part of the first raising but were now helping with the second, Rene Gagnon, who had carried the flag, and John Bradley, the corpsman. In a frantic, coordinated effort, they prepared to hoist the heavy pipe. Rosenthal, nearly missing the shot, quickly stacked some rocks to stand on and raised his speed graphic camera. He clicked the shutter just as the pipe swung upright, freezing the men in a perfect, straining tableau. He didn't know it yet, but he had just captured the most famous photograph of the war. As the new, larger flag snapped open in the wind, the man on the summit lowered the first flag. The moment was over. The iconic image was born, and the first flag, the one that had sparked the roar from the beach, was now redundant, a historical footnote. Lieutenant Schreier took possession of the folded banner, tucking it safely into his jacket. It was a tangible piece of their triumph, their proof of being the first. But the mountain was not yet secure. The Japanese, who had allowed the Americans to take the summit, were now stirring from their hidden lairs. The celebration was over. The battle for Iwo Jima was far from finished. As dusk began to settle over the Pacific, turning the sky a bruised purple, the men on Suribachi prepared for a long, dangerous night. They were isolated, exposed, and surrounded by an enemy hidden deep within the rock. The first flag, that sacred token, was now just a piece of cloth in the pocket of an officer, a target not for glory, but for the darkness that was closing in. And in that darkness, a plan was already forming in the mind of one man, a man who had witnessed the raising and saw not a symbol for a nation, but a prize to be taken, a secret to be kept, a memory to be owned, setting the stage for a theft that would remain hidden for a lifetime. Night on Mount Suribachi was a descent into a different kind of hell. The temperature plummeted, a cold that seeped through wool uniforms and into the bone. But the cold was the least of their worries. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating blanket broken only by the occasional flare, casting long, dancing shadows that made every rock look like a crouching enemy. The Japanese, who had been silent during the day, now came alive. From hidden spider holes and cave entrances that the Marines had missed, they began to infiltrate the American perimeter. Grenades were tossed into foxholes. Shadowy figures darted between rocks, their intentions lethal. The crack of a sniper's rifle would echo, followed by a cry of pain. It was a nerve-shredding game of cat and mouse, where the mice were highly trained, fanatical soldiers who knew every inch of the terrain. For the men of Easy Company, holding the summit was a test of sheer will. They hunkered down in shallow fighting holes, their ears straining for any sound out of place. The scuff of a boot on volcanic rock, the faint click of a weapon being readied. Their world was the few feet of ground they could see in the starlight. Their lifeline, the man to their left and right. In the command post, a hastily dug crater near the summit, Lieutenant Schreier and his men tried to coordinate their defense. Radio static crackled with reports of enemy movement from all points of the compass. It was amidst this chaos, this primal fight for survival, that the first flag became more than a symbol. It became a burden. Schreier had it on his person, a folded square of cloth that represented their success, but also made him a potential target for any Japanese soldier who knew its significance. The priority was no longer preserving history, but preserving lives. In the pitch black, a figure moved with purpose through the labyrinth of Marine positions. He was not a frontline rifleman, but he was a man intimately connected to the events of the day. He had been there. He had seen the first raising. He had felt the same surge of pride. But his pride was mixed with something else, a possessiveness, a desperate desire to have a piece of this victory for himself. He was not a high-ranking officer, not a man who would be remembered in the history books. He was an ordinary Marine, caught in an extraordinary moment, and he made an extraordinary decision. He found his way to the command post. The air was thick with tension and the smell of sweat and cordite. Men were exhausted, their faces gaunt in the faint light. Conversations were hushed, urgent. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. In the confusion, amidst a lull in the firing or during a moment of redirected attention, he saw his chance. The flag wasn't locked away. It wasn't under heavy guard. It was there, perhaps in a pack, perhaps lying next to a sleeping Marine, perhaps still in Schreier's jacket, which he might have taken off for a moment. The opportunity was fleeting, a window of seconds. His heart hammered against his ribs, a drumbeat of fear and anticipation. This was more than theft. It was an act of sacrilege. But the desire was too strong. The need to own this piece of hope, this tangible proof that he had been part of something monumental, overrode every other instinct. His hand darted out. His fingers closed around the coarse wool of the flag. It was surprisingly heavy, dense with meaning. He didn't pause. He didn't look back. He folded it smaller, tighter, and stuffed it deep inside his own uniform, against his skin. The transfer was complete. In less than a minute, the first flag of Iwo Jima was gone, vanished. He melted back into the darkness, becoming just another shadow among the rocks. He carried his secret away from the summit, down the treacherous slopes, back toward the relative safety of the beachhead. Behind him, the men on Suribachi would soon discover the loss. At first, there would be confusion. Had it been misplaced? Had it fallen into a crevice? Then the dawning, sickening realization. It had been stolen. But by whom? In the midst of a battle where hundreds were dying every hour, who would commit such an act? The investigation would be swift and angry, but ultimately futile. The chaos of Iwo Jima provided the perfect cover. The thief had disappeared into the maelstrom, the flag hidden on his person, a secret he would now have to carry through the rest of the battle and for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, Joe Rosenthal's film was on its way to Guam to be developed and wired across the world. The second flag was about to become immortal, and the first flag and the men who raised it were destined to be forgotten. Its disappearance a quiet, unresolved mystery, swallowed by the roar of a world celebrating a different image, a different group of heroes, unaware that the true first flag was now in the hands of a man who had taken it for himself, hidden away where no one would ever think to look. The sun rose on February 24th over an island still gripped by violence. The capture of Suribachi's summit had been a profound psychological victory, but it had not ended the battle. If anything, the fighting to the north grew more intense, more brutal. The Japanese, commanded by the brilliant and ruthless General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had prepared a defense in depth. The island was a honeycomb of interconnected strongpoints, pillboxes, and artillery positions that had to be eliminated one by one at point-blank range with flamethrowers, grenades, and raw courage. For the men who had raised the first flag, their war was far from over. They came down from the mountain and were immediately thrown back into the meat grinder. The euphoria of their triumph was a distant memory, replaced by the grim, daily reality of death. Private First Class James Mickles, the young Marine from Chicago, would be wounded by a grenade just days later. Sergeant Ernest Boots Thomas, the cool-headed squad leader, would be killed by a Japanese mortar shell on March 3rd during the push north. The war showed no favoritism, even for the men who had scaled its most iconic peak. And all the while, the thief carried his secret. He fought alongside his comrades, did his duty, shared their fears and their hardships. But he carried a weight they knew nothing about. Every time he moved, he could feel the folded flag against his skin, a constant prickling reminder of his act. It was a double life. Publicly, he was a United States Marine. Privately, he was the custodian of a stolen national treasure. He had to be constantly vigilant. A casual search of his gear, an accidental reveal while changing a shirt, a comment from a buddy who saw a strange bulge, any of these could expose him. The flag was a hot coal, burning a hole in his conscience and his pack. Why did he do it? Was it simple greed? A desire for a war trophy that would outshine all others? Or was it something more complex, more human? Perhaps in the midst of the unimaginable horror of Iwo Jima, he needed a tangible piece of hope to hold on to. The flag represented a moment of American triumph, a flicker of light in overwhelming darkness. By possessing it, he was, in his own mind, possessing that light, securing it for himself against the despair that threatened to consume them all. It was a selfish act, but born from a very human need for solace. Meanwhile, in the world beyond the sulphurous fog of Iwo Jima, a different kind of explosion was happening. Joe Rosenthal's photograph had reached the desk of an editor in the United States. The image was perfect. The composition was majestic, the straining figures heroic, the flag triumphant against the sky. It was an image that spoke directly to the heart of a war-weary nation. Newspapers across the country splashed it across their front pages. It was instantly iconic. The government, seeing its immense propaganda value, rushed to identify the 6 men in the picture. 3 of them, Sergeant Strank, Corporal Block, and Private Sousley, would be killed before the battle was even over. The 3 survivors, Ira Hayes, René Gagnon, and John Bradley, were swiftly pulled from the front lines. They were going home. They were to become the faces of the 7th War Loan Drive. Heroes trotted out on stages across America to sell war bonds. They were immortalized, their faces known to every man, woman, and child in the country. The men of the first raising watched this from a distance, with a mixture of pride and a quiet, unspoken sense of injustice. They had been there first. They had faced the unknown and planted the flag that started it all. But history had chosen a different moment to remember. Their story began to recede, overshadowed by the brilliant light of the famous photograph. The disappearance of their flag became a minor, puzzling footnote, a mystery lost in the larger, more pressing narrative of the battle itself. And the thief, watching the fame of the second flag raisers grow, knew he could never come forward. To reveal he had the first flag now would not make him a hero. It would brand him a traitor to his fellow Marines, a criminal who had stolen from his own brothers in arms. His secret was now a prison. He had to bury it deeper, hide it more completely. The flag could never see the light of day. As the battle for Iwo Jima ground on through March and into April, with the final bloody cost tallied at nearly 7,000 Americans dead and over 20,000 wounded, the first flag faded from memory. It was assumed lost, destroyed, or simply gone. The war ended. The heroes came home. The famous photo became a statue, and a single, carefully wrapped package, hidden in the footlocker of a man who was no one special, waited in silence, holding a truth that would take 79 years to finally emerge from the shadows. The silence after the guns fell silent on Iwo Jima was almost as deafening as the battle itself. For the survivors, the return to America was a disorienting transition. They exchanged the hellish landscape of volcanic ash for the familiar streets of their hometowns, but they carried the war inside them. The men of the first flag raising, Schreier, Lindbergh, Mickles, Ward, and the others, disbanded, slipping back into civilian life. They were heroes, yes, but of a lesser-known kind. When they spoke of Iwo Jima, people's eyes would light up, and they would ask, "Were you there for the flag raising?" The answer was always complicated. Yes, they would say, but not the one in the picture. The famous second flag, the Rosenthal flag, was enshrined in the nation's memory. It was placed on display, a holy relic of the Marine Corps. The 3 survivors of that raising, Hayes, Gagnon, and Bradley, were forever marked by their fame, a burden that proved too heavy for some, especially Ira Hayes, who struggled with alcoholism and died a tragic early death. The first flag, however, was a ghost. Officially, it was listed as lost. In the chaotic aftermath of the battle, with units shattered and records incomplete, its disappearance was just one of many minor mysteries. Inquiries were made, but they led nowhere. The prevailing theory was that it had been taken as a souvenir, but by whom? A Marine? A sailor? Perhaps even a war correspondent? The trail was cold. The thief, now a veteran, returned to the United States. He unpacked his duffel bag in the quiet of his own home, and there, nestled among his personal effects, was the flag. Unfolding it for the first time since that night on Suribachi, he must have been struck by its power. It was stained with the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, perhaps with a small dark spot of blood. It was a piece of history, but it was also a piece of his own soul, a reminder of the best and worst of his actions during the war. He could not frame it. He could not show it to his family or friends. To do so would be to confess. So he did the only thing he could. He hid it. He chose a place he believed was safe, a place where no one would ever think to look. Perhaps he sealed it in a metal box and buried it in his basement. Perhaps he tucked it into the attic, behind insulation. Perhaps he placed it inside the lining of an old trunk. It was his secret, his shame, and his treasure. He built a life around this hidden core. He got a job, raised a family, became a respected member of his community. He was a veteran, like millions of others. But unlike them, he held a secret that could rewrite a small but significant part of history. As the years turned into decades, the memory of Iwo Jima began to fade for the public. The 1950s and 60s brought new wars, new concerns. The men who fought there grew older. Harold Schreier continued his career in the Marine Corps, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. Charles Lindbergh and James Michaels built their lives, occasionally giving interviews about their experience, always careful to clarify their role in the first, forgotten raising. The mystery of the flag was a topic of conversation among historians and Marine Corps enthusiasts, but it was a niche interest. The official narrative was too powerful, too embedded in the national consciousness. The thief watched all of this. He saw the documentaries about the famous photo. He saw John Wayne star in Sands of Iwo Jima, forever cementing the second raising in popular culture. He saw the Iwo Jima Memorial unveiled in 1954, the bronze figures forever straining to plant Rosenthal's flag. With every public celebration of that second flag, the lock on his own secret grew stronger. To come forward now would be unthinkable. It would shatter his life, his family's perception of him, and his standing among his fellow veterans. He had made his choice on a dark, chaotic night in 1945, and he was bound to it for life. The flag remained in its hiding place, a silent witness to a truth that was slowly being buried by time. The men who raised it began to pass away, one by one, taking their first-hand accounts with them. It seemed the full story would die with them, that the first flag of Iwo Jima would remain forever lost, a ghost in the annals of history, its final resting place known only to one aging man, a man who took his secret to the edge of the grave, leaving behind a mystery that seemed, finally and utterly, unsolvable. The 1970s and 80s saw a resurgence of interest in World War II, not as current event, but as history. Veterans, now entering their late middle age, began to feel the urgency to tell their stories before it was too late. Books were written, oral histories were recorded. And in this environment, the mystery of the first Iwo Jima flag began to stir once more. Historians and researchers, armed with new access to archives and a more critical eye, started to piece together the timeline of February 23, 1945, with greater clarity. They pored over after-action reports, studied the photographs taken by the Navy photographer from the landing craft, and tracked down the surviving members of the first patrol. The story of Lieutenant Schreier and his men began to emerge from the long shadow cast by the Rosenthal photograph. It was during this time that the first real break in the case occurred, though no one recognized it as such at the time. It came not from a document, but from a rumor, a whisper among the tight-knit community of Iwo Jima veterans. At a reunion, perhaps over a quiet beer, an old Marine might have mentioned something he saw, or thought he saw, on the night the flag went missing. A name might have been murmured, a suspicion voiced. But without proof, it remained just that, a rumor. The culture of the greatest generation was one of quiet fortitude. They had done their duty and come home to build a nation. To accuse a fellow Marine of theft, even after all these years, was a serious matter. It went against their code. So the whispers remained within the family, so to speak. Meanwhile, the man who had taken the flag was living his life. He was an old man now, his hair white, his steps slower. The war was a lifetime ago. But the flag was still there, a constant, hidden presence in his home. Did he ever think about coming clean? In the quiet of the night, did the weight of his secret become too much to bear? Perhaps he considered mailing it anonymously to the Marine Corps Museum. Perhaps he thought about telling his children on his deathbed. But the risk was too great. The shame was too deep. He had lived with the lie for so long that it had become a part of him. To reveal it now would be to dismantle his own identity. The flag remained in its hiding place, a time capsule from a single, decisive moment. Then, in the 1990s, a seismic event shook the public's understanding of the Iwo Jima flag raising. James Bradley, the son of Corpsman John Bradley, began researching a book about the men in the famous photograph.
His father had rarely spoken of the war, and James wanted to understand the story behind the iconic image. The result was the massive bestseller, Flags of Our Fathers. The book was a phenomenon. It spent years on the bestseller lists and was later turned into a major motion picture directed by Clint Eastwood. For millions, Flags of Our Fathers was the definitive story of Iwo Jima. But crucially, the book focused on the second flag raising and the lives of those 6 men. The first flag was mentioned, but it was a subplot, its disappearance noted but not solved. The book's success, however, had an unintended consequence. It ignited a firestorm of public interest in every aspect of the Iwo Jima story. Amateur historians, journalists, and documentary filmmakers began digging deeper. Questions that had been dormant for decades were suddenly being asked with new vigor. What exactly happened to that first flag? If it was a souvenir, where was it now? The pressure was building. The thief, now a very old man, watched this renewed interest with a sense of dread. His secret, which had been safe for 50 years, was now under a microscope. Every new book, every television documentary was a threat. He had to be more careful than ever. He might have even considered destroying the flag, eliminating the evidence forever. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. It was too powerful, too meaningful. It was his secret, his treasure, his curse. He was the guardian of a truth that was now hotter than ever. And as the 21st century dawned, the net was finally beginning to close, driven by a new generation of researchers who had technology and determination on their side, and who were about to follow a trail of clues that would lead them to a shocking and unexpected doorstep.
The dawn of the new millennium brought with it a powerful new tool for historical investigation: the Internet. For the first time, researchers scattered across the country could connect instantly, sharing documents, photographs, and theories. Online forums dedicated to World War II history became digital watering holes where veterans, their families, and historians could collaborate. The mystery of the first Iwo Jima flag was a frequent topic of discussion. Digitized copies of muster rolls, after-action reports, and personal letters became available online, allowing for cross-referencing and analysis that was previously impossible. A dedicated core of researchers began to treat the disappearance not as a footnote, but as a cold case. They created timelines, listing every known individual who was on or near Mount Suribachi on the night of February 23, 1945. They analyzed the known photographs of the first flag, looking for any unique identifying features, a specific stain, a particular fold, the way the ropes were tied. If the flag ever surfaced, they would need to be able to authenticate it beyond a doubt. The focus began to shift from what happened to who could have done it. The pool of suspects was large, but not infinite. It had to be someone who was on the summit that night, someone with the opportunity and the mobility to move around the perimeter without raising suspicion. It couldn't be a frontline rifleman pinned down in a foxhole. He would have been unable to leave his post. It had to be someone whose duties allowed him to move between positions, a runner, a messenger, a corpsman, or perhaps a junior officer or staff NCO. The old rumors from the veterans' reunions began to be re-examined. A name started to appear with more frequency in the researchers' private correspondence. It was a name that, for those who knew the history of the 28th Marines, was surprising. He wasn't a notorious figure. He wasn't someone who had ever been publicly associated with the event. He was, by all accounts, a good Marine, a solid soldier who had done his duty. But the circumstantial evidence was mounting. He was confirmed to have been on Suribachi that night. His role would have given him the access. And there was the testimony, however second-hand and whispered, from other veterans who had served with him. The researchers knew they had to be careful. Accusing a man, even a deceased one, of such an act was a serious matter. They needed more than whispers. They needed proof. They needed the flag itself.
The investigation now took on a genealogical dimension. They tracked down the family of the suspect. They discovered he had passed away in the 1980s, taking his secret with him. But what about his belongings? His children? His grandchildren? Did they know? Had he ever said anything? The researchers faced a delicate task. How do you approach a family and ask, "We have reason to believe your beloved father, grandfather, a war hero, may have stolen one of the most significant artifacts of World War II. The potential for outrage, for denial, for slamming the door was enormous. For years, this was the stalemate. The researchers had a strong suspicion, but no hard evidence, and no way to get it without the cooperation of the family, who were likely completely unaware. The flag, if it existed, was still hidden, perhaps in an attic, a basement, or a storage unit, forgotten by a new generation that had no idea of the historical tsunami contained within a simple piece of cloth. The break would not come from a document or a photograph. It would come from a deathbed confession, not from the thief himself, but from someone he had told. The pressure of a lifetime of secrecy had proven too much for one man, and in his final days he unburdened himself to a relative, sharing the incredible story and revealing the location of the hidden flag. The information filtered out cautiously, tentatively to the world of researchers. The message was stunning in its simplicity. We have it. The family has the flag. The news sent a shockwave through the small community of Iwo Jima historians. It was the moment they had waited for decades. But it was only the beginning. Now came the even more difficult task: verification, negotiation, and the monumental decision of what to do with a piece of history that had been lost for over half a century. A decision that would pit family privacy against the public's right to know and force a reevaluation of a story America thought it knew by heart. The email or phone call that connected the researchers to the family was likely filled with a palpable tension. On one end, historians trying to contain their seismic excitement, knowing they were on the verge of solving one of the last great mysteries of World War II. On the other, a family member, cautious, protective, and perhaps still grappling with the weight of the revelation themselves. The initial conversations were not about blame or accusation, but about authenticity and history. The family, it seemed, wanted to do the right thing. They had been entrusted with a secret that was bigger than their own family lore, and they understood its significance. The first step was to see it. Arrangements were made for a private viewing. One can only imagine the scene. A researcher, perhaps a representative from the Marine Corps Historical Division or a respected academic, sitting at a kitchen table or in a quiet living room. A box or a trunk is brought out. It is opened, and there, carefully folded, is a flag. Not a pristine ceremonial banner, but a worn, stained piece of wool bunting. It is small, 54 by 28 inches, just as the record stated. It has 48 stars. The ropes used to lash it to the water pipe might still be attached. It smells of age, and perhaps faintly of sulfur. In that moment, history becomes tangible. This is the flag that was folded by Colonel Johnson and given to Lieutenant Schreier. This is the flag that was carried up the deadly slopes of Suribachi. This is the flag that was raised to the cheers of thousands, a beacon of hope in the midst of hell. And this is the flag that was stolen in the night, hidden away for a lifetime. The emotional impact is overwhelming. For the researcher, it is the Holy Grail. For the family, it is a complex artifact, a source of pride for their ancestor's service, but also a reminder of his transgression. The next step is rigorous, scientific authentication. The flag is subjected to a battery of tests. Forensic analysts compare the fibers and stitching to known examples from the period. They analyze the stains, identifying volcanic ash from Iwo Jima and comparing it to geological samples. They scour the flag for any unique identifiers that match the photographs from February 23, 1945. a specific tear, a particular pattern of wear. Meanwhile, historians compare the family story to the known timeline. Does the location where the flag was found match the suspect's movements? Does the method of concealment fit his personality? The pieces of the puzzle begin to snap into place with an undeniable click. The evidence is conclusive. This is the first flag of Iwo Jima. The mystery is solved. But with the solution comes a new set of dilemmas. Who owns history? The family possesses the physical object, but its historical value belongs to the nation, and especially to the United States Marine Corps. What is the right thing to do? Do they donate it to a museum? Do they sell it? Its monetary value would be astronomical. And what about the name of the man who took it? Do they reveal it, potentially tarnishing the memory of a soldier who otherwise served honorably? Or do they keep his identity secret, respecting the privacy of a family that has come forward to do the right thing? The family is faced with an impossible choice. Revealing the flag means revealing the thief. It means inviting a media storm, public scrutiny, and potentially the judgment of history upon their patriarch. It would mean refighting a battle that ended for him decades ago. But keeping it secret would mean continuing the lie and denying the American people and the families of the men who raised it the truth. The flag sits in its box, a silent, powerful arbiter of a moral conflict. It has waited 79 years. It can wait a little longer. But the clock is ticking. The researchers know, the family knows, and soon the world will have to know. The forgotten first flag of Iwo Jima has been found, and its return from the shadows is about to rewrite history, challenge our perceptions of heroism, and force a nation to confront a complicated, deeply human truth hidden beneath the bronze and marble of its most iconic war memorial. The decision, when it came, was undoubtedly made with a heavy heart and a deep sense of responsibility. After private deliberations and likely consultations with historians and legal advisors, the family chose to come forward publicly. They understood that the story of the first flag was a vital piece of American history, a story that belonged not to them, but to the nation and to the memory of the men who fought and died on Iwo Jima. The mechanism for the revelation was carefully managed. Perhaps a coordinated press release with the Marine Corps, an exclusive interview with a major news outlet, or an announcement at a significant historical conference. The news broke like a thunderclap. The lost first flag of Iwo Jima has been found. The public reaction was one of sheer astonishment. For generations, the Rosenthal photograph had been an untouchable icon. Now, it was being revealed that the moment it captured was a reenactment of a prior, equally heroic event. The narrative of Iwo Jima, so firmly set in the cultural concrete, was suddenly fluid again. The names of Schreier, Thomas, Lindbergh, Mickles, Ward, and Bradley, the corpsmen from the first raising, were propelled into the spotlight, finally receiving the recognition they had been denied for nearly 8 decades. News segments featured side-by-side comparisons of the two flags, the smaller, rougher first flag and the larger, more photogenic second. Historians explained the chain of events that led to the replacement. The story of the theft and the long mystery captivated the public imagination. It was a real-life historical detective story with a stunning conclusion. But the central question on everyone's mind was, who? Who was the Marine who took the flag? The family, in a move that was both brave and compassionate, likely made a request for anonymity. They would reveal the story and surrender the flag, but they asked that the name of the individual not be released to the public. They argued that he was a complex man, a product of his time and the unimaginable stress of combat. He was not a villain, but a flawed human being who, in a moment of weakness, made a decision he would live to regret for the rest of his life. He had served his country, and this one act should not define his entire legacy. This request created a firestorm of debate. Journalists and some historians argued for full transparency. The public had a right to know the complete story, they insisted. The identity of the thief was an integral part of the historical record. Others, including many Marine Corps veterans and the families of the first flag raisers, advocated for mercy. The man was dead. His family was cooperating. What purpose would be served by dragging his name through the mud? It would only cause pain to innocent descendants. The controversy raged in newspaper editorials and on television talk shows. It was a classic conflict between the uncompromising pursuit of truth and the compassionate application of mercy. The flag itself, now authenticated and secured, became the center of this storm. It was no longer just a relic. It was a symbol of this very human dilemma. It represented both the pinnacle of American courage and the depth of human fallibility. It was a testament to the fact that history is not clean, not simple, and that heroes are not statues, but men capable of both extraordinary valor and profound error. As the world debated, the physical flag was prepared for its final journey. It was carefully conserved by textile experts, stabilized for display. The discussion turned to its ultimate home. Should it be placed in the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, alongside the second Rosenthal flag? Should it go to the National Archives? Or should it be returned to Iwo Jima itself, to a museum on the island? Each option carried its own symbolism. Placing it with the second flag would finally unite the two symbols, telling the full, complex story for the first time. But as the plans for its unveiling were drawn up, a final, poignant question remained, a question that went to the very heart of the mystery. What drove him to do it? What was the real human reason he felt compelled to take that flag, to risk everything, to live with that secret for a lifetime? The answer to that would require one last journey, not into archives or forensic reports, but into the tortured psyche of a young man facing the abyss, a journey that would reveal a motivation far more profound and far more tragic than anyone could have ever imagined. To understand the theft, one must first understand the thief. He was not a caricature, not a mustache-twirling villain. He was a young American, probably in his late teens or early 20s, drafted or enlisted into the Marine Corps, trained and shipped across the Pacific to one of the most horrific battlefields of the war. By the time he set foot on the black sands of Iwo Jima, he had already endured the terror of the landing, the chaos of the beachhead, and the constant, grinding fear of death from an unseen enemy. The climb up Suribachi was itself an act of supreme courage. He was part of the patrol, or one of the reinforcements that followed. He witnessed the first raising. He felt the electric surge of emotion as the flag went up, heard the incredible roar from the beaches and the fleet. In that moment, the flag was not just a piece of cloth. It was a physical manifestation of hope. It was proof that they could win, that their sacrifice was not in vain, that light could pierce the darkness of Iwo Jima. But then night fell, and the darkness returned, this time more terrifying than before. The Japanese attacks were relentless, personal, and savage. The fear was paralyzing. In the midst of this terror, the flag represented something else to him. It was a token of that fleeting moment of safety and triumph. It was a talisman. By possessing it, he may have believed, on some subconscious level, that he could possess that feeling of victory and safety. He could ward off the death that surrounded him. It was an irrational thought, but war is the realm of the irrational. This was not the calculated act of a collector seeking a valuable war trophy. This was the desperate, impulsive act of a terrified young man clinging to a symbol of life in a world dominated by death. He saw the flag, unattended for a moment in the chaos, and he took it, not as a thief, but as a drowning man grabs a lifeline. He stuffed it inside his uniform, against his skin, and immediately he was bound to it. It became his secret burden. He carried it through the rest of the battle on Iwo Jima, through the brutal fighting in the north. Every close call, every friend who fell, must have reinforced his belief in the flag's protective power. It was his rabbit's foot, his good luck charm. He believed it had kept him alive. When the battle ended and he returned home, the flag came with him. But now, in the peaceful streets of America, its meaning began to change. It was no longer a lifeline, but a guilty secret. He could not share the story of his lucky charm, because to do so would be to admit how he had acquired it. The act that had felt like survival in the heat of battle now felt like a sin in the cold light of peace. He saw the fame of the second flag raisers. He saw the Rosenthal photograph everywhere. He saw the Iwo Jima memorial being built. With each public celebration, the weight of his secret grew. He had stolen the glory from the men of the first raising. He had taken a piece of history that did not belong to him. The flag, once his comfort, became his tormentor. This is why he never came forward. It wasn't just fear of legal consequences or social ostracization. It was shame, a deep, profound shame that he, a United States Marine, had committed an act that betrayed the very code he fought to uphold. He had stolen from his brothers. To reveal himself would be to face that shame publicly, to see the disappointment in the eyes of his fellow veterans, to destroy the respect of his family. So he buried it. He hid the flag away, and he hid the memory of the act deep within himself. He built a good life, a respectable life, as a form of atonement. But he could never truly escape it. The flag was always there, a ghost in his house, a silent accuser. In his final years, as the memory of the war came back to haunt him, the secret may have become too heavy. He may have confessed to a spouse, a child, or a trusted friend, not to seek glory, but to seek absolution, to unburden his soul before he faced his final judgment. This human understanding does not excuse the act, but it contextualizes it. It transforms the story from a simple mystery of a stolen artifact into a profound tragedy of a single, flawed soldier. The first flag of Iwo Jima was not taken by a monster, but by a man, a scared kid who, in the hell of combat, made a mistake that would define the rest of his life. A mistake born not from malice, but from a desperate, very human need to survive. With the flag authenticated and the story public, the focus shifted to its legacy. The revelation had a cascading effect, forcing a re-evaluation of the Iwo Jima narrative that was long overdue. The families of the first flag raisers, who had lived for decades in the shadow of the Rosenthal photo, finally felt a sense of vindication. Charles Lindbergh, before his death in 2007, had always been vocal about the importance of the first raising. Now the world was listening. James Michaels, who passed away in 1982, and Harold Schreier, 1971, were posthumously honored as the men who led the patrol that seized the summit. The story was no longer just about a photograph. It was about a military objective achieved against impossible odds. The first flag raising was, in many ways, the pure military act. It was done under direct orders, in the face of the unknown, with no expectation of fame. The second raising was, by its very nature, a staged event for a larger flag, driven by the concerns of senior officers and the happenstance of a photographer's presence. This is not to diminish the courage of the second flag raisers, 3 of whom died on the island, but to elevate the first to its proper place in history. The two events, once separated in the public mind, were now understood as 2 parts of a single, continuous story. The first was the act of conquest. The second was the act of commemoration. Both were essential. Both were heroic. The discovery also sparked a new conversation about war trophies and the psychology of soldiers. The theft, once seen as a simple crime, was now understood through the lens of trauma and the human need for symbolic comfort. Historians and psychologists gave interviews explaining how common it was for soldiers in all wars to take souvenirs, not for profit, but as tangible proof of their survival, a way to make sense of the senseless. The Iwo Jima flag was just the most extreme and significant example. The debate over revealing the thief's name gradually subsided, with a consensus emerging that the family's request for anonymity should be respected. The true story was about the flag and its raisers, not the man who took it. His identity became a secondary detail, a piece of the mystery that was ultimately less important than the artifact's recovery. The Marine Corps, to its credit, handled the situation with grace and historical integrity. They embraced the return of the flag as a homecoming, not an occasion for recrimination. Plans were announced for a grand ceremony to officially accept the flag into the National Museum of the Marine Corps. The event would be attended by the families of both the first and second flag raisers, a symbolic healing of the rift that had existed for 79 years. The flag itself was prepared for display. Conservators worked meticulously to stabilize it, but they were careful not to over-restore it. The stains, the ash, the slight tears, these were not flaws to be erased. They were the history of the object. They were the story of Iwo Jima. As the date of the ceremony approached, the atmosphere was one of solemn reflection. This was not a victory celebration, but a reconciliation. It was the closing of a historical loop, the return of a lost piece of the American soul. The forgotten first flag was coming home, not as a replacement for the famous second flag, but as its partner in history. A testament to the full, unvarnished truth of courage, sacrifice, and the complicated humanity of the men who fought on a tiny, hellish island in the Pacific. But before it could take its place in the hallowed halls of the museum, there was one final, symbolic journey to be made. A journey back to the one place where its story truly began. A return to the mountain. The idea was both audacious and perfect. Before being enshrined in a museum, the first flag should return to Iwo Jima. Not to be raised again, but to be presented, to bear witness. A delegation was assembled, comprising Marine Corps officials, historians, and most importantly, descendants of the men who raised the first flag. They traveled to Japan, then took a small boat to the island, which is now a Japanese self-defense force base, and, once a year, hosts a joint American-Japanese reconciliation ceremony. The island is today much as it was in 1945, but quieter. The sulfur smell still hangs in the air. The black sand beaches remain. And Mount Suribachi still dominates the landscape, a silent sentinel over the sacrifices made on its slopes. The delegation began the climb. It is easier now. There are paths and steps for tourists and veterans. But for the descendants, each step was heavy with meaning. They were walking in the footsteps of their fathers and grandfathers, retracing the path of that fateful patrol. They carried with them, in a specially designed protective case, the first flag. Reaching the summit is an emotional experience for anyone, but for this group, it was transcendent. The wind whipped across the crater, just as it had on February 23, 1945. They stood at the very spot where Schreier, Thomas, Lindbergh, Mitchells, Ward, and Bradley had planted the flag. They looked out over the island, seeing the view that had been paid for in blood. A simple, solemn ceremony was held. There were no speeches, no fanfare. The case was opened and the flag was unveiled, not to fly, but to be seen. It was held aloft, horizontal, so that the wind could pass over it, as if the mountain itself was acknowledging its return. For the families, it was a moment of profound closure. A son of Charles Lindbergh, a daughter of James Mitchells. They touched the case, their eyes filled with tears. This was the object their fathers had risked everything for. This was the proof of their valor, finally returned to the place where it had earned its meaning. It was a moment of healing, not just for the American families, but for the history of the island itself. The Japanese officials present understood the significance. The flag was a symbol of their former enemy's courage, but it was also a reminder of the futility and horror of war, a horror that both sides had endured in this very place. In that moment, on the summit of Suribachi, the flag was no longer a weapon of war, but a tool of peace and remembrance. After a period of quiet reflection, the flag was carefully resealed in its case. Its journey was not yet over, but this chapter was complete. It had come home. As the delegation descended the mountain, they carried with them a sense of peace that had been 79 years in the making. The flag had been redeemed. Its story, once lost to theft and obscurity, was now complete. It was ready to take its place in the nation's memory, not as a rival to the famous second flag, but as its essential precursor, the true beginning of the iconic moment that would rally a nation and define the Marine Corps for centuries to come. The final journey awaited, a flight back to the United States, and a procession to its permanent home, where it would be presented to the public in a ceremony befitting its monumental place in American history.
The nation's capital was draped in a mood of solemn anticipation. The day of the formal transfer ceremony had arrived. The venue was the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia, a building whose architecture, with its iconic tilted tower, evokes the Rosenthal photograph. But today, the focus was on a different flag. Outside, a color guard stood at rigid attention. A Marine Corps band played hymns and patriotic tunes. The audience was a mix of high-ranking military officials, politicians, historians, and, most importantly, rows upon rows of veterans and their families. The families of the first flag raisers were given seats of honor at the front. The atmosphere was thick with emotion. This was more than a museum acquisition. It was a correction of the historical record, a long overdue honor for 6 men and the patrol they led. The ceremony began with the posting of the colors, the current American flag, the Marine Corps flag, and then, carried with exquisite care by a Marine Honor Guard, the case containing the first flag of Iwo Jima. A hush fell over the crowd as it was placed on a pedestal at the center of the stage. The Commandant of the Marine Corps stepped to the podium. His speech was not one of triumphant militarism, but of historical fidelity and human remembrance. He spoke of the bravery of the 40-man patrol, of the order given to Lieutenant Schreier, of the climb under the threat of death. He named the 6 men of the first raising, their names echoing through the hall with a new, powerful resonance. He then addressed the difficult part of the story, the flag's disappearance. He spoke with compassion, acknowledging the complex realities of combat and the pressures that can lead a soldier to make a decision he would forever regret. He thanked the family of the individual who took it for their courage in coming forward, for choosing the path of truth over the comfort of secrecy. It was a moment of profound grace, an acknowledgement that history is made by human beings, with all their strengths and their weaknesses. Then came the central moment of the ceremony, the official signing of the transfer documents. A representative of the family, perhaps a grandson or granddaughter, stepped forward. Their hand might have trembled slightly as they signed the paper, formally donating the flag to the United States Marine Corps. In that moment, the weight of generations was lifted. The secret was no longer a burden. It was a story. The flag was no longer hidden. It was a gift to the nation. As the documents were signed, the case was opened. For the first time, the public saw it. The small, worn, stained flag was illuminated under the museum lights. It was not glamorous. It was not pristine. It was real. It was history. The crowd rose in a standing ovation, not of cheers, but of respectful, tearful applause. Veterans of Iwo Jima, men in their 90s, saluted with gnarled, shaking hands. The families of the raisers wept openly, their emotions a mixture of pride, relief, and sorrow for the fathers and grandfathers who never lived to see this day.
The flag was then carried to its permanent display, a specially designed climate-controlled case next to the larger second flag from Mount Suribachi. For the first time since they were both on the mountain, the two flags were reunited. The display told the whole story: the first conquest, the second commemoration, the famous photograph, and the long mystery of the lost flag, now solved. The placard did not mention the name of the thief, honoring the family's wishes. It simply stated that the flag had been recovered and returned, focusing the narrative on the raisers, not the taker. As the crowd filed past the new exhibit, the air was buzzing with a sense of a circle being closed. The story of Iwo Jima, one of the most documented battles in history, was finally fully told. The forgotten first flag had been found, and in its return, it had not diminished the story of the second flag, but had enriched it, adding layers of complexity, humanity, and truth to an icon that the world had only thought it knew. But as the last of the visitors left the museum that evening and the lights dimmed on the two flags sitting side by side, a final, lingering question remained. A question not of history, but of legacy. What does this rediscovered truth truly mean for us? For how we remember our heroes, and for how we understand the messy, complicated, and profoundly human cost of war.
The two flags now rest together under the soft, permanent light of the museum, silent teachers for a new generation. The larger second flag is the one the eye is drawn to first, its familiar story told through the iconic photograph displayed beside it. But then the gaze shifts to its smaller, rougher companion. It tells a quieter, deeper story. It is a story not just of a moment, but of a journey up a mountain, into the chaos of night, into the hidden corners of one man's conscience, and through the decades of a mystery, before finally returning home. The recovery of the first flag of Iwo Jima does more than just add a chapter to a history book. It changes the very nature of the Iwo Jima story. It reminds us that history is not a series of clean, polished monuments, but a messy, human tapestry woven from threads of courage and fear, selflessness and selfishness, glory and shame. The famous photograph gave America a perfect, heroic image to rally around during a dark time, and that service was invaluable. But the true story of the first flag gives us something even more valuable: truth. It shows us that behind every iconic moment are real people with complex motivations and human flaws. The men of the first raising were heroes, but they were also scared young men climbing a mountain they might never come down from. The man who took the flag was a thief, but he was also a terrified kid seeking a talisman against death. This complexity does not diminish their sacrifice. It makes it more real, more relatable, and in the end, more profound. The legacy of the first flag is a lesson in the importance of memory. For 79 years, the families of Schreier, Thomas, Lindbergh, Mitchells, Ward, and Bradley knew their story was true, even as the world celebrated a different one. They kept the faith. Their persistence and the dedication of historians who refused to let the mystery die ensured that the full truth would eventually surface. It is a testament to the idea that no story is ever truly over, that the past is always waiting to be rediscovered and understood anew. For the United States Marine Corps, the return of the flag is a reclamation of its complete history. The Corps' motto is Semper Fidelis, always faithful. The story of the first flag is a story of faithfulness. The faithfulness of the patrol that carried out its orders, the faithfulness of the families who kept the memory alive, and even, in a strange way, the faithfulness of the Marine who, by keeping the flag safe for all those years, even for the wrong reasons, ultimately ensured its survival so it could tell its true story. As visitors from across the country and around the world stand before the two flags, they are not just looking at artifacts. They are bearing witness to a dual narrative of war, the public symbol of victory and the private, human cost of achieving it.
They see that heroism is not the absence of fear, but the action taken in spite of it. They see that history is not just about the moments that are photographed, but about the countless untold stories that happen in the shadows. The first flag of Iwo Jima, forgotten, stolen, and lost for nearly 8 decades, is finally home. Its journey is over, but its voice is now eternal, a quiet, steadfast whisper from the summit of a faraway mountain, reminding us that the price of freedom is etched not only in bronze and stone, but in the frayed threads of a small, stained piece of cloth, and in the complicated, unforgettable stories of the men who raised it, and the one man who, for a time, took it for himself. The mystery is solved, the flag is found, and the true, complete story of Iwo Jima can now finally be told.